Hi, this presentation is aimed at giving you an overview of process tracing methodology, trying to explain some things about it, how it can be used by you to do, as part of your research, as your research design for a paper, and possibly a capstone paper. Okay, the references for this, a lot of it, I mean, I'm not going to say that Van Evera is the guy who came with it, but in 1994, Van Evera talked about process tracing, and he's often cited in his Guide to Methods for Students of Political Science, which is a useful little book, small, but it goes into case studies and qualitative research in a useful way. Derek Beach, though, is very closely associated today with process tracing methodology. And he and Peterson co-wrote Process Tracing Methods, second edition. And that is kind of the go-to text today. Kind of a big book. It gets very abstract into things, and and so it's a bit deep. But that is out there if you really want to go deep into this. Also, Beach has a introduction, a slideshow, a PowerPoint from 2012 that is a resource associated with the text that is available from University of Michigan Press website. And really that, I really am depending a lot on that lecture PDF for this presentation, and I'm just trying to emphasize parts of it so you can go look at yourself, and I highly recommend that. But I wanted to kind of highlight certain parts of it and kind of put it into some context for students in our program. Just try to demystify it a little bit. Okay, what is process tracing? And just basically going off of what Beach talks about in his own presentation, it's a single case research method that can be used to make within case inferences about the presence and absence of causal mechanisms. So here we have a few key components. It's for use when looking at a single case. And that makes it very different from comparative method, from quantitative research, which has many cases. And, we talk about large or small n studies. Well, this is an n of one, right? One observation. And sometimes you want to work within a case. And so it is aimed at that, and it makes inferences about the presence and absence of causal mechanisms. And there's a lot of discussion of causal mechanisms. And the idea is if you think X causes Y, well, how does that work, right? How does democracy produce peace? What are the functions? What are the set of interlocking parts that produce this outcome, right? And this is what process tracing that's the process that it traces and it looks for. And so that's the key thing. Van Evera in his 1997 is talking about, he describes it this way: the cause-effect link that connects independent variable and outcome is unwrapped and divided into smaller steps. Then the investigator looks for observable evidence of each step, which, by the way, just explained the whole thing. Not elegantly, I'll admit, but the idea is you've got a theory, right, that has an independent variable, often called an explanatory variable, and there's an outcome that we often call the dependent variable. And you unwrap it, right? The idea is you're unwrapping, unpacking. You're basically saying, okay, what are the parts? In dividing it into steps, and then you look for observable evidence of each step. Basically, that's in a nutshell what it is about. But let's make it more complicated. Okay, and stealing from Beach here, reproducing his slide, he kind of says, look, we got two levels here. On the top, we have the theoretical level, right? And we have X, which is the nomenclature for the independent variable. And so we have some independent variable that is, or a set of them, that is thought to produce the outcome. And in between them, we have a bunch of these mechanisms, right? Steps. These are the steps that Van Evera talked about. And so the idea is you need to do conceptually, you need to break out, hey, between the cause and effect, between the starting condition and the outcome that you observe in a case, theoretically, what are we saying happened? What are the steps in the story the theory tells? What are the steps, the interlocked parts, and how this thing functions, right? I always talk about theories giving you a schematic of the world, right? Telling you the important causally linked parts that go from, that produce an outcome. And that's what this is talking about, this causal mechanism. So it starts with, and by the way, this is theory guided process. There are empirical processes. There are different kinds of process tracing. In this presentation, I'm only going to focus on the theory guided one, because that's the one I think most people will use, and I kind of want to steer people towards. So we have this theoretical level, and then we have the empirical level, which is what we observe in the case. This is the data, the facts, the things we know happened in the actual case. And so you have presumably empirical manifestation of X, right? The empirical isn't that cool? Manifestations of each part of the mechanism and the manifestation of the outcome, right? And so what we're looking for is, we're trying to observe these things and we're looking for the empirical manifestation of X, but most importantly, presumably that's there. A lot of what you're focusing on when you're actually going in to study the case is you are focusing your attention on empirical manifestations of each part of the causal mechanism to see whether or not it's there, right? That's the trace, right? What are, and later the term empirical fingerprint comes up, but here empirical manifestation is a fancy way of saying it. And so that's what you're looking for in the case study. What's so important about this is that it guides you, right? Once you say, hey, here's this theory, here's what the theory says the parts are, it tells you what to look for, and it gives you an idea of which data is important, what data isn't important, and what it means when you find or don't find it, right? So this is theory guided in a nutshell, theory guided process, or in a picture. Now, this slide is, I know it's kind of hard to read. It goes through, this is an example of, hey, what are the mechanisms, right? And so here we have, and again, this is from Beach, and it's more perhaps readily readable in his, but it's the idea of what is the causal mechanism whereby democracy produces peace. And, so we have the condition X. We have a pair of states where, one state is democratic and the other one is either democratic or autocratic, illiberal, liberal or illiberal. And then it has these parts, and each part is, liberals will trust states that are liberal and mistrust those they consider illiberal, right? That's one part. And then the next part in the link is when liberals observe a foreign state becoming liberal democratic by their own standards, they will expect specific relations with it. Liberals will claim that fellow liberal democracies share their ends and that illiberal states don't. Liberals will not change their assessment of foreign states during crises unless these states share their institutions, and liberal elites will agitate for policies during war-threatening crises, and all of that is supposed to add up to, during crises, statesmen will be constrained to follow liberal elites, thereby not going to war with each other, with other liberal states. So here's a breakdown, right, from the theory of what should happen in a crisis, right, between states. And when we have a case where we have a liberal a democratic state facing off against a democratic or non-democratic state, right? And each part of this is part of, the chain of mechanism. And so this is the trace. This is the top part of the, this is the causal mechanism. This is the top part of what we were just looking at. And a key thing to look at here is we have, and this is going to come up, that we have entities doing things, right? Underlined, we have liberals will trust or mistrust, right? They will observe, they will expect, they will claim, right? Liberal elites will agitate, right? And so we have entities doing things, and that's a big part of the causal mechanism. All of this, by the way, comes from the theory, right? And this is the trace of what you expect the process to look like if the theory is correct, right? And then what you do is you bounce this and you say, all right, what should we observe for each part here, right? What would be the empirical manifestations of each part, and can we observe them in whatever case you pick, right? And presumably you pick a case of a, one liberal nation in a crisis with another liberal nation, right? To see why didn't they go to war, right? And we need to see all of the manifestations of all of these parts in order for the theory to hold water. And that's basically what you're focused on here. Okay, so that's just an example. Let's take a more general look. Causal mechanisms. And again, this just breaks this down. This is Beach's thing. He says, look, we have activities and entities, right? And in each part, we have the entity doing something, and it goes from X to Y, right? Starting from our scope conditions, because that's the conditions the theory says, must apply for the theory to be valid, right? And a simpler way of, here's a simpler thing, a different democratic peace thing is that liberal groups agitate, governments are dependent upon liberal elites, and they respond. And this is the causal mechanism, much more simple. But it kind of, I like this idea of we have entities doing things for each part, right? So when we have to create the trace, because part of the methodology is you're going to have to create this trace, right? You're going to have to create this theoretical process trace out, right? Or timeline. What's the theoretical timeline of events and the critical causal parts, right? Going from the condition, the independent variable, the explanatory variable, to the outcome or the dependent variable. Okay, here is the whole process. Oh my God. And this is, now there are different types, right? This is the theory testing process tracing. There is theory building process tracing, which I'm not discussing here. Basically, however, you have the same picture and you reverse the order of steps. And then there's outcome explaining, and let's not even go there. Okay, that's very different. Here is theory testing, and this is I think very often what you're going to do. And so this is, I think, the most common one. And the idea here is we have 3 steps in the process, right? Step 1, conceptualize the causal mechanism. And that's all that discussion we just had of, well, what, based on the theory, right? Well, I mean, first of all, you start with the theory that you're going to test, right? You have some idea. And remember, a theory is just an explanation. It's a causal story, right? And it says, look, the reason this happened is because, right? It can be, theories can be grandiose. They can be liberalism, realism, and all those big theories you study in the intro course and in the theory course. Or they can be very specific, right? About, what a cause of terrorism is, or about what, someone can have an idea that this causes, something causes democratic transitions, or, they can be very, very specific things. And to a certain extent, they can even be case specific, right? If someone supposes something caused an outcome, if it's supposed that this is the thing that caused an outcome in a case, well, what's the story? How does that work? What's the causal mechanism? And so the idea is you start with the theory, and then you conceptualize the causal mechanism, and you have to say, okay, what are the entities and activities? What are the different parts? There's 2 parts here. There could be more parts. There could be 10 parts. There could be 4 parts. The middle part expands, so you have a trace. You have this story. I call it a story, causally linked events, or a schematic of a system that produces an outcome. However you want to think of it, we've got these different parts of the causal mechanism. Step one, you say, okay, if this theory is true, then here is what we should see happening in this case, right? Then in step two, you operationalize that and say, all right, in operationalizing the causal mechanism, you're going, okay, if that causal mechanism I just laid out is true, what are the empirical manifestations? What should we observe? Right, again, the empirical fingerprints, that's the term I really like. And you say, all right, what are the observable manifestations of all of these things? And you fill in, you say what each of these circles are, right? From the presence of the independent variable that ought to be there, right? To each part entity conducting an activity as each part goes through to the final outcome. And those are the things you're going to look for, right? That now becomes your, in the military they have, or they used to have PIRs, primary intelligence requirements, priority intelligence, something like that. They were basically the things you needed to know. The commander said, look, I need to know this, that, and the other thing, right? Well, here, that's what you've got. This is what I need to find out. This is what we need to see and we need to look for. And that simplifies your data collection in a lot of ways. And also, it gives you an idea. When you find it, what does it mean, right? And well, it's evidence that this part of the causal mechanism was there. And so you say, all right, that's what I'm going to go look for. And then step three, you collect the evidence, right? And you go and you look at it and you say, okay, is the evidence there or not? Right? So that's basically the 3 steps, and it organizes your study of the case based on the theory, which, but it does require you to do work. You need to conceptualize the causal mechanism. And so I always tell people when they're doing case studies, you need to really have, you can't just go and start sucking, talking about the case and just blah, blah, blah about the data. You need to get into what's your theory, what do you expect to find in this case if your theory is right, and then, go in and look at the data the theory tells you should be looking at. That gives you a plan. It gives a structure to it and moves it from just a descriptive journalistic or historical recount narrative into a more analytic approach, right? This is, I often talk about needing a framework for analysis. Here it is. There's your framework. Okay, I've been using the term empirical fingerprints, but Beach describes the logic of empirical testing in this, right? So we're doing empirical testing, and his idea is that the logic is if we expected X to cause Y, each part of the mechanism between X and Y should leave the predicted empirical manifestations which can be observed in the empirical material. So finding the predicted manifestation passes the test. Failing to find fails the test. And these are the tests, right? Now you can think of them as tests. You can also think of them as evidence. And very often when people, when they start talking about, okay, how do you actually analyze, once you collect the data, how do you evaluate it? What do you say about it? We go to criminal justice, right? Both Van Evera talks about, evidence in a trial, and Beach and a lot of people go into the Sherlock Holmes story. That's very much part of this. I'm not going to engage too much in that, but there is this idea of, hey, look, finding that stuff or not finding it, finding the predicted empirical manifestation or failing to find it is a piece of evidence. It's a clue or it's a test. And what does it mean if you pass a test or fail the test, right? Because it doesn't necessarily, they're different. There's if you don't find the predicted manifestation, that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't there, right? Or that the whole thing is just you didn't find it. And so there's a question of, for each of these predicted manifestations, for finding or failing to find them, what kind of test did they do? And so we'll talk about 4 types of tests. Here they are. Now, these ideas were originally presented by Van Evera, and basically we have, there are really 2 types of tests here. Okay, there's the hoop test, where you make your idea, you make the theory jump through hoops. And if it fails to jump through the hoop, then it's disconfirmed, right? And they talk about certainty and uniqueness. This is the technical term that gets used a lot. It started with Van Evera, and it certainly was picked up by Beach. When something's high certainty, I don't know why certainty is used here, honestly, but there's the idea that if it doesn't, that failure to have this disconfirms the theory, right? That if the theory is true, this must be the case, right? Or, that we have to pass this test. And however, passing the test doesn't necessarily mean the theory is true, right? That would be uniqueness. Uniqueness is confirming evidence, right? So the hoop test is this idea of, hey, your theory has to jump through a hoop, right? And any failure to jump through the hoop disqualifies it, right? However, jumping through the hoop doesn't necessarily qualify, right? The example they give is, hey, look, if you ask someone for an alibi, and here comes the trial, right? If I can show that, was somebody in town on the day that the crime was committed, right? Well, if they weren't in town, they couldn't have done it, right? And so that would disconfirm the hypothesis or the theory that this person committed the crime, right? But it doesn't necessarily, yeah, they were in town. It doesn't prove anything. But, we keep going through all the, you go through a lot of those, and you might start to, well, all right, this is plausible at least, right? In contrast, the smoking gun is high uniqueness, and it's confirmatory, right? And the idea is if you discover a smoking gun, then it's very clear, if the person standing there with a smoking gun standing over the body, well, they did it, right? The thing is, if you don't discover the murderer standing over the body with a smoking gun, doesn't mean they didn't do it, right? It's not necessary that you find that person. It's just sufficient if you find them standing over them with a smoking gun that, yes, they are the ones that did it. They're the one that did it. And so that's the idea of the smoking gun test. And high uniqueness, that is confirming, but low certainty, meaning that if you don't find a smoking gun, it doesn't mean they didn't do it. It just means you haven't proved it. So, okay, what are these other 2? Well, you notice hoop test, high certainty, smoking gun, high uniqueness. Guess what? The other 2 are just, straw in the wind is just low both, right? Low certainty, low uniqueness. And so it doesn't really, do that much for you. And Van Evera likes to say, yeah, and this is pretty much a political science, what we deal with most of the time. Doubly decisive, on the other hand, is high in both uniqueness and certainty. Both, if you don't find, if you don't jump through the hoop, person didn't do it. But if you do jump through, oh, absolutely did it, right? Or the theory is absolutely correct. And so in a lot of ways, the four tests are just really two things, but they're four corners of a two-dimensional space, basically. But these are the things. And so what's the point of all this? That, in some ways, it's a little disappointing when you read this. You go, well, what's this mean? Basically, every prediction you have, your predicted empirical manifestation that you create, you look at it and you kind of have to assess it and say, well, what does this do? Does this, in fact, is this just a hoop that the theory has to, jump through? That, yeah, this is something that we, if you didn't see this, it would kind of disconfirm the theory, but the fact that we see it doesn't sell us on it, right? I mean, or is it a smoking gun? Or is it just a straw in the wind? Or, and doubly decisive, yeah, don't even worry about it. You aren't going to find too many of those in the real world. So really, hoop test and smoking gun are, I think, the two things. And they both, by the way, there's also the concept of necessity and sufficiency, necessary conditions, sufficient conditions. They also line up with these things. Hoop tests are the necessary conditions. You have to pass the test in order for it to be true, but if it passes, it doesn't mean necessarily true. Smoking gun passes that test, it is sufficient to do it. Key thing, in looking at what you found and didn't found, you kind of go with these, right? And you can talk about, yes, this type of information, this would be, and you could do it actually before you even go into the discussion. When you're in step 2 and you operationalize the causal mechanism, you can say this will be a hoop test, or this will be a smoking gun test, or we've got a few straw in the wind tests, and so we'll see what we get. That's fine, as long as you're honest about what it is. This is what a lot of folks are talking about. I don't know that it solves things, but it does give you an idea of how you're supposed to take the discovery or failure to discover the predicted empirical manifestations, or the empirical fingerprints. I like that. What does that tell you, right? And it certainly, though, does go to this idea of we are testing, and we should have some logical, considered view of what it means, right? You should always know going in, when I find this, what will it mean, or what won't it mean, right? And that is part of having a framework for analysis that's so important, and it gives structure to your case study, and it gives structure to your argument, and I think it's an important thing. So I hope I've tried to make this as quick as possible. This is an overview. There are a lot of links to things I provide in my courses, links to various writings on this subject. Collier goes deep into the 4 types of tests, and other folks will go into different steps in the process. But this is an overview, and I hope it helps explain things. And as always, you can go to the source, and really probably the best source looking at these is go and look at Beach's presentation. It's just the slides. They go into a lot of other aspects, but I think you'll be able to digest them now pretty well. You might have before, but that's a good go to the source. Derek Beach is definitely a go-to guy when it comes to process tracing. But I hope I've helped you out a little bit in getting started on it.